Good morning. Welcome to the library and the Veterans History Project. We're so glad you're here. Can everyone hear me? I have a cold, so yeah, great. I'm so just honored and pleased to be here in recognition of Veterans Day with colleagues and friends, our amazing panelists all day for this all-day symposium. The Veterans History Project, as you probably know, was started in October of 2000 through unanimous legislation of Congress and passed into law by then President Clinton. And we have over 108,000 individual stories of first-person veterans experience from World War I through the recent conflicts. And those come to us through voluntary donation from the people who create them from all over the country. Some of them we create ourselves with our staff and colleagues, and the vast majority, though, come from donation. The Veterans History Project considers first-person narrative to be anything that speaks to that first-person experience, whether it is an oral history. Our specifications are 30 minutes or longer of audio or video oral history, but also items of personal reflection that tell that narrative arc. So collections of 10 or more photographs, letters, documents, or 20 or more pages of journal or memoir. And that gets us to today, and one of the reasons that we're so excited to kick off this symposium, The Road Back, looking at poetry and literature, participating in it, creating it, discussing it, to cope with and express the veterans' experience. I'm really excited to introduce you to our panelists, and I'll do that in just a second. But I also wanted to acknowledge our panelists from the second panel who will be with us this afternoon and invite you to stay, grab some lunch, and come back and see that panel. And we also have a film this afternoon in the Pickford, and just so you know, that's across the street in the Madison building. And while you're here, you might as well check out the World War I exhibit, which is part of the reason we're all gathering today. So to begin, I'd like to share a little bit about each of the panelists who are going to be speaking with us today, and a little bit about their organizations. Immediately to my left is Lavella Kalika. She is a writer, and I'm reading this because I want to get it right. A writer, photographer, and multimedia artist, she is the founder and director of Warrior Writers, a creative community for veterans articulating their experiences. She has edited 4 anthologies of veterans writing and artwork, has received 3 Art and Change grants from the Leeway Foundation, and was honored with the Transformation Award in 2009. A self-published author of 2 chapbooks of her poetry, she is currently at work on her next book. Lavella is a co-founder of the Filipino-American Artist Collective, Tatlo Mestizas, and served on the board of Culture Trust Greater Philadelphia. Having worked closely with primarily post-9/11 veterans for 14 years, she has trained staff of arts organizations and universities around the country on how to better work with and understand veterans. She is also part of the caregiver program of the VA. A little about Warrior Writers. It's a national nonprofit based in Philadelphia whose mission is to create a culture that articulates veterans' experiences, builds a collaborative community for artistic expression, and bears witness to war and the full range of military experiences. They employ writing, painting, photography, and a host of other mediums to reflect on those personal experiences and express them creatively. Just to her left is Mohammed Sharif. Can I say Mo for everyone? Yes. Mo is a Literature and Arts Education Division Coordinator at the National Endowment for the Arts. Before taking this position, he managed the translation and creative writing fellowship programs for the NEA. Prior to the NEA, he spent 4 years in the United States Marine Corps and served in Korea, Kuwait, Japan, Marshall Islands, and Iraq. He received his MFA and Arts Management Graduate Certificate from American University. As you may know, the National Endowment for the Arts was established by Congress in 1965. It is an independent federal agency whose funding and support gives Americans the opportunity to participate in the arts, exercise their imaginations, and develop their creative capacities. Through partnerships with state arts agencies, local leaders, other federal agencies, and the philanthropic sector, the NEA supports arts, learning, affirms and celebrates America's rich and diverse cultural heritage, and extends its work to promote equal access to the arts in every community across America. I love our collection of names. Stephanie Takach is the executive director of the Touchstones Discussion Project, where she leads organizational management and oversees educational curriculum development, teacher training, and coaching. She co-designed with Howard Zeiderman, Touchstone's co-founder, Completing the Odyssey, A Journey Home, and NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, funded program for veterans, among other numerous Touchstones discussion programs and several textbooks she developed or co-developed. She is also the author of 5 books on First Peoples, published by Scholastic Press. Mr. Takach earned a BA from St. John's College in Annapolis and an MS in Educational Psychology from Fordham University. As part of her commitment to ensuring all people have access to Touchstone's educational programs, she runs 2 weekly discussion groups as a volunteer within the Maryland Correctional Institute for Women. The Touchstones Discussion Project is an educational nonprofit dedicated to building critical thinkers and collaborative leaders through inclusive dialogue and community. Since 1984, their programs have engaged more than 5 million people, from school children to nonagenarians, from the most vulnerable and at-risk populations to executives and political leaders. Rooted in collaborative learning and leading, they use a train-the-leader approach and replicable programs to partner with teachers, leaders, community builders, and volunteers, running Touchstone discussion groups in 47 countries and in 6 languages. So you see, it's quite a panel. VHP, the Veterans History Project, is a program of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and it has been known since the beginning, when it was called the Veterans Oral History Project, as primarily an effort of oral history. However, as I mentioned earlier, we also seek to capture the personal narrative of veterans and their experience, and notice the influence and the emphasis on personal narrative as expressed through the way they want to do that themselves, through letters, journal, diaries, and creative works. Those creative works are 2-dimensional. We are not looking for sculptures of spent ammunition, thank you. But we are looking for poems and other ways of self-expression in that 2-dimensional capacity poetry. And I'm gonna take this with me and disappear behind the podium because I found this amazing collection that I think really illustrates a lot of what we're talking about here today. This is Joseph Rosenblum, and you can see one of the 80 pages of his journal from World War I. Mr. Rosenblum was born in Romania, and he was drafted into the U.S. Army in April of 1918. He served in the States in field artillery. In between guard duty and 13-mile hikes and all the other duties you normally hear about in these journals and diaries and expressions of veterans' experience, he actually talks more about the sonnets and fugues that he was thinking about from his time playing the piano. And his entire journal isn't full of the daily doldrums of what it was like to be a soldier, but instead of how Voltaire made an impression on him, of how Tolstoy made an impression on him. I love this page in particular. Down at the bottom, you can perhaps see in his beautifully expressive script, "One is made to kiss their books, expressing such truth and sincere thought." So you can see from this how much, even in the midst of duty, the need to express and create and interact with these items can be so important to veterans. One other collection I want to draw your attention to is that of Rona Marie Knox Prescott, who served during Vietnam as a nurse in country and unfortunately lost a dear friend of hers through really difficult circumstances. But when she came back, she found solace in poetry, and her poems brought her great comfort, and she left them at the Vietnam Wall. Because she left them at the Vietnam Wall, the family of her friend who passed away was able to connect with her, and they found solace in her poems. So I just set these as sort of, to beg a terrible analogy, touchstones to our conversation here this morning. And I'll go ahead and sit down now and join our panelists. The format will go this way. I'll ask them questions, and they will respond to them, hopefully in a conversational manner. And then towards the end, we'll try to engage with some questions for those of you in the audience. Thank you.
Test.
So thank you again for being here with us. This question, I thought it would be nice to throw out to all three of you for considering, which is, I just gave two examples of collections that are so important from the personal narrative perspective, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, anyone who wants to go first, from your experience in the work that you've done, either in your organizations or as an individual that's military connected or a veteran, a little bit about the importance of self-framing their narrative for veterans and how that relates to the creative and coping process. Is that too tough to start with? Is that a tough one?
Just jump right in.
Is that too much? Well, you want to think on that one, and Steph, I'll throw you one. I think it'll be easier for you. Would that be easier?
Or I can speak to the
Can you speak
initial
to that
question. I think for us, in this work that we started with veterans, while our work in prison for many, many years has included incarcerated veterans, the work that we did through the NEH-funded program titled Completing the Odyssey, A Journey Home, really gave us an opportunity to hear from veterans, perhaps even for themselves for the first time, an articulation of what their experience of service was like. For many of the veterans, what they discovered and what we discovered along with them through their process of revisiting and exploring experience was a current relevance of that experience. And they may have tucked it away and not really revisited those memories or any of the connections that they had made to others, or the connections of service to their current life. It really was a moment of reintegration in ways, I think for many of them, that they had not really been afforded or given themselves before.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, I think it's, I think in some ways, society expects veterans to have certain specific experiences, sometimes the victim or the hero. And I think when you do the writing, when you encourage people to do honest writing, they get to a place where they're sort of pushing past those, stereotypical feelings and experiences, and you hope to allow veterans to come to another place of digging deeper and maybe seeing things in a different way and seeing things in a way that they couldn't before. So in the military, you can only think a certain way or believe certain things, or if you're in a hospital setting, maybe you can't really talk about some of the problems with the care you're receiving. And I think for us, it's really important that we encourage veterans at Warrior Writers to just not censor themselves and be really push for that honesty and be really open and come to deeper realizations. And through the writing, we do that. And so, some of them have said, I'm facing problems with my care, or I feel guilty about what I did. And so I think in a lot of places you can't really say what you need to say, or you can't maybe feel angry, or you can't feel betrayed, or you can't feel guilt. And I think it's just really important that veterans can feel just like anybody else, whatever they need to feel and say what they need to feel about it. So I think framing it that way is in terms of like just being really open to whatever needs to come out is okay. And I think in certain cases, not everybody's willing or able to hear that, but I think it's just really important.
Yeah, I think for me, specifically, writing was always something I always engaged in. And for me, writing my personal experiences sort of starts from my childhood, not to go all the way back. So my parents are from Liberia, and we came to this country because of the Liberian Civil War. So we were in the war for at least a year with all kinds of, terrible experiences. And that experience sort of put its signature on my entire life, right? And I think for me, after going to the military and going to the military to sort of understand what that crazy experience was, for me, the writing was a way of sort of making those experiences abstract, where I could look at them and see this would speak to this and this would speak to this, right? And to your point of being able to express yourself openly, it was something I always did because I had to get it out, right? And for me, writing was that medium that just played so well. Even when I was in Iraq, I mean, I'd write every day, because it just had to, if it didn't come through me, it would just stay in me, right? And then, going to do my MFA, they sort of structure what you're saying and allow you to really frame yourself and see yourself on the page and make yourself a character, right? Where you can really objectively look at yourself. And it's extremely cathartic, obviously, and useful.
And I think too, writing, what we talk about is that it provides a little bit of distance.
Yeah.
So you can kind of look at it with a different perspective instead of being in it and all of these experiences being in your head and on top of you. You have that distance and you say, well, what word do I want to use, or what was that experience really? And so it's kind of like playing with Tetris, or just kind of figuring it out, and you have that distance, and it allows just a little space, and then you have that perspective, and you can see it in a different way than sort of being consumed by it, I think.
It's interesting when you talk about making it abstract and making yourself a character and finding that distance. It leads me to consider a little bit about what Touchstones is doing with Homer's Odyssey. And I'm wondering, Steph, if you could talk a little bit about the role of existing works of poetry and literature and examining veterans' experience, because it strikes me that those themes are very connected.
When we were looking at our program design, part of the structure was to include works of literature from two different periods of conflict. So we had the Odyssey representing an ancient conflict, and then we wove in more contemporary voices through personal accounts and fiction and poetry. And so for us, those literary excerpts or selections are similar in the way that you described, providing distance. For us, the text also provides distance. It allows some space between the immediate experience, and you read about whatever it is that Odysseus is doing and considering how one's own experience is or is not like that. That distance allows you to sort of go closer or not, right? You can sort of choose how close you want to get until you're ready. And then we bring in the more contemporary piece, which really is closer. Simply the language is closer, the experience is closer. So it was very interesting to sort of watch over the course of the discussions how the veterans would first look at this ancient work and relate their own experiences to it, and then look at a more contemporary piece, and it would become much more, closer to home, obviously. And I think in that, being able to take those risks that are part of that self-exploration and using these, whether it's writing or pieces of literature, as tools for self-examination.
In your experience in helping the veterans see themselves, or maybe from personal experience as a central character to this larger story. Did you find, specifically you, Stephanie, but anybody who wants to answer, did you find it shifted the way they expressed, as the program goes along, the way they expressed themselves?
We did find that, and part of what was, I think, for us, really so meaningful in terms of the feedback at the end of the program was the veterans themselves recognized that there had been a lot of movement within them personally, and sort of a type of redefining of and reclaiming of experience that they may really not have known what to do with prior to going through this process. But I think it was, and with the writing, that it's the process, right? This takes place over time, and I think that's a really essential component in having this become fruitful for each individual on an individual basis.
Yeah, I think, I think there's some really great narratives out right now. Kevin Powers, Birds, anything by Yusuf Kamiyaka. For me, reading those narratives, it's like when you meet another veteran, and you guys, it's almost like you speak a different language because you understand point by point exactly what the experience is, and you're speaking words, but you're seeing a whole world attached to that. And that's not experience. I think oftentimes when I'm reading something, I'm like, do they even get what's going on here? Because this is like speaking to me. This is my experience, and you see yourself, illuminated in some sense, and it feels like home. It feels like, yes, this is my voice. This is my experience, and I'm not alone in this, right? You also get a chance to revisit it in a safe space, right? And I think that's very important, and at least safe space in your head, I guess, because it can affect you. But it's just the other half of, I think, writing.
It's interesting that you say that because it seems like it doesn't matter where in time that veteran's voice is coming from. Is that true for you personally? That's really interesting. We face this theory, this conception, maybe it's a misconception, quite a bit in the work we do here at the Veterans History Project, this notion that veterans are reticent to talk about their experience, and that, my dad served or my mom served, but she really doesn't want to talk about that, or my director served and she thinks her story isn't important. This barrier that you have to get across about that they're not just reticent to speak about their experience, but that pushes them to another direction of also being resistant to seeking support or help or therapy. And that, there's this notion, we talked about this, that there's no I in team. And, from a veteran's perspective, you're so used to having a mission and having a team. And I'm wondering, specifically, I'm thinking here of Steph and Lovella, but if you'd like to talk from that first person experience, if you could both share a little bit about how do you overcome those potential barriers to participation? Is that a concept that affects your work? And to make it really complicated, I'll throw another twist in there, is how do you overcome that barrier to reach the veterans with whom you work? And then how do you expand that past just the veterans that you're working with in this moment to get your message across to other key stakeholders in the community?
Well, I think, first of all, to your point about that it's hard for people to talk about, veterans to talk about their experiences. I mean, I think that's based in history, right? So for how many years has everybody been told, oh, don't ask grandpa about the war, right? So that's a cultural thing that's been happening for however many years. And I think our generation, it's different now because we have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have all these things where everybody's trying to speak. So I think that's changing, but part of it is it's culture. And I know about, I've read about veterans who came home and sort of people didn't want to hear about their experience, or they started to talk and then everybody left the room. So I think it's hard to also find opportunities to really talk about those things. Like, you're not just going to walk up to someone in a bar and say, oh, so how was it in Iraq? Like, and if you do, it's not really the right moment or space to do that. And you also don't know if that person's going to ask you, have you ever killed anybody? You know, so we need to create these spaces that are appropriate to talk about. So the things that we're doing with Warrior Writers and the Touchstones Project, these are the ways that people are able to do this because the space and the time and the moment was created to say, okay, we're going to talk in depth about these things. And one of the things that Warrior Writers does is we do these Working with Vets 101 trainings where we say, don't ask things like, did you ever kill anybody? You know, we talk about post-traumatic stress. We talk about how these things happen and how to interact with veterans in a way that's healthy and supportive to really listening. In terms of speaking about these things and also seeking help, I think that's culture too. So it wasn't until the 80s, I think, that post-traumatic stress was even put into the books as a real disorder or a real condition. So now that everybody knows that it's a thing, that's good, but we still need to talk about what that really means, and we need to make it okay to talk about that. So at Warrior Writers, we say it's okay to be angry, it's okay to talk about these issues, and we're not therapists. I'm not an art therapist, none of our team members are, but we are connected, we are well connected to resources and alternative healing and other people and other opportunities for people to get support. So we don't just say, go talk to a therapist. We'll say, hey, do you want some referrals? Do you want me to sit with you while you call someone? Do you want me to take you to an appointment? And we follow up with people and we say, you know, there's also acupuncture, there's also massage, there's also Reiki, there's lots of other opportunities. And I think, you know, culturally we're sort of stuck in this talk therapy thing, which not everybody likes to do, veterans or not, especially veterans, but also just kind of thinking about the whole self and the whole body in terms of what that means, and also it's not just that veteran's job to go get help, but it's our job as a culture and society and community to be involved in this reintegration process. I think people see the VA and they see, you know, these programs out there for vets, oh, the veterans are getting taken care of. Well, no, that's all of our responsibility. The VA is not funded enough, and we can all be engaged in this. And so for Warrior Writers, we really believe that art can help do that, and it allows people a way to connect. You can really say things through art that you can't easily say just on a panel or in an academic conversation or whatever. So I think with art and community involvement, you can really sort of set the stage and say this is an open and welcoming space for healing and connection and talking about these hard things that there's not really opportunities for in everyday life.
Yeah, I think in our experience, which is very similar, the initial approach with gaining trust from people requires time, and that is not something that can be accelerated. So we build that into our programs, and these are not one-off moments where people come together, but these are 8, 9, 10-week-long programs. We also have brought veterans in to train veterans to run the discussions together, so that it is a partnership already going across the different line from civilian to veteran, and building trust across those different sectors of our society. Going forward, and so in training veterans to run the program that we developed through the NEH funding, one of those discussion leaders, who's a Vietnam veteran, then took the program to a homeless shelter in Baltimore City and replicated the program there with a very different population of veterans than who we had seen in our first 2 programs. But that is part of our hope and our aim, is that these are highly replicable programs, and when veterans themselves are trained, then it's no longer, it can go out and have wings, and their work can reach other people, because the level of trust from veteran to veteran is so much greater initially than what we could hope to achieve as civilians. But that is, as we look at our next iterations of programs, we are, not only will we replicate the work that we did with the Odyssey program, but we are building a program that is deliberately bringing civilians and veterans together to look at a couple of works And we hope that, again, we'll be able to train veterans, and we'll also train civilians in that program to then take that program out to other communities. So I think the need is great, and creating opportunity for people as volunteers to have something to do. I think many people aren't sure what they can do, and so I think that that's part of what these types of programs are offering to people.
Just to add to that, I think it's important to recognize the value of veterans' family members. So I'm a military family member as well as you. I think that the family member community is interested in engaging and talking and getting the veterans to talk about this stuff. So I think Warrior Writers also got an NEH grant, the Dialogues on the Experiences of War. And so we're doing discussions in Philly, and we have family members as part of that as well. And so I think the family members are interested in coming out and participating, and there's lots of conversations across the veteran community about engaging family members more, because the family members, I think, well, obviously they have access to the veterans, but also they're really looking and needing the kind of support and conversation, because obviously it affects us all so intimately.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of that, your earlier point. I think there's something very unique to having a community of people who are focused on writing, but also focused on veteran writing. I think there's a distinction there. When I was in my MFA, it was okay because you become this anomaly and you're writing about something with a unique perspective, but it's also very isolating, and you feel alone, and you feel like you're saying something, and you're very scared to say all the things you want to say. You're really scared to write all the things that you really want to write in the way that you want to express it, because you are self-conscious about how you'll be perceived. The difference of this community is that everyone sort of shares that experience. Everyone has, quote unquote, this extreme thing to express, right? And there's a safe space where you don't feel judged, where you don't feel like you're saying too much or doing too much. And that's why I think it's very unique to have these places and to get the word out for veterans to go to these type of places as opposed to just your regular MFA.
And I think that the trick about what you're talking about too is, if you're the only veteran in that space,
Right.
then they're going to sort of see your experience as the veteran
Right,
experience.
exactly.
And I think we really need to push those. You mentioned a couple of folks. The books out there right now, Phil Cly, Kevin Powers, these are also all like straight white males. So we really need to push to include those voices of the female veterans, people of color, indigenous veterans, queer veterans. They're out there, and their voices need to be held to the light. And if we don't do that, we're just sort of hearing the same sort of stories, and also just kind of saying, okay, well, this is the veteran experience.
Right.
And we just really need to push back on that.
So many themes here that I was really hoping we'd get to, exploring the notion of veteran to veteran. It's something that we've been talking about with some of the other panelists in the conversations leading up to this symposium. The notion of where the powerful connections happen, and does it have to be veteran to veteran, or can you reach past that? Because from our perspective, part of the power of the work that we do at the Veterans History Project is in connecting people to the veteran and giving them that tool for a meaningful activity that isn't inappropriate questions or uncomfortable questions, but allows them to do that important self-framing. And the notion of, it sounds a lot like the ways in which you overcome those barriers to finding the veterans is through that veteran pipeline, veteran to veteran, family member to family member, and that need to have that, the authentic beyond putting a flyer, at the library or the local coffee shop. But one thing that you've each touched on too is, the work that each of us does really dances around that we are not medical professionals, we're not sociologists, we're not people who are counselors, but we're engaged in work that enables self-expression, and so enables a kind of freedom. And I'm wondering if you could talk, and I think really all three of you would have things to say about this, but this idea about these writing programs can sometimes be, or working with arts, or working with discussion, that it's therapeutic. But is there some other what other benefit, or, I mean, if we're not therapists, why are we all here doing this? Is there some other benefit that isn't therapeutic to what this process is? And would you mind talking a little bit about specifically the creative process and whether that's tapping into existing creative items or engaging in the creative process that you, from your perspective, see as beneficial to the veterans you're working with? You want to go first,
Yeah,
Mel?
sure. I would say, I mean, the one daunting thing is that veterans commit suicide a lot because they don't have a certain space or a venue or outlet for a lot of things. I think that, number one, just reaching people and allowing people to be visible and deal with their issues and get it out and feel like they can do that in a safe space, I think that alone is a good measure for why it's important. I think, you know, taking your experiences that are terrible or maybe deemed terrible and making art out of it helps other people, right? If I see that and I see that experience and I know that I'm not alone in this experience, but also you get to own your experience. It doesn't own you. And I think that's the most important. And that's not something that you come across in any other sense, right? Like art allows you to feel like I own this experience. I craft it, I make it, I mold it, I present it. You know, I can make the most horrible things sound beautiful and poetic and all these different things, but I own that, right? It doesn't own me, and it's not in me, and it's not tearing me apart, right? I think that, and giving someone the awareness of that, and that they have that ability of power, I think is, you know, absolutely worthwhile.
I think for a lot of veterans so we work with active duty service members in the DC area who a lot of them are sort of getting out of the military, transitioning out. And I think there is at the end of that military career a question of identity and purpose and mission. And so I think that the artistic process, I think, can really be helpful in figuring out, you know, who am I now? What am I now? We do a prompt with the active duty service members, sort of when I say I am an American soldier. And so we encourage them to say, when I say I'm a parent or a teacher or a lawyer or whatever other identities they're starting to dig into and thinking about what's next for them. So I think it's helpful in terms of finding identity. A lot of, you know, obviously a lot of folks we work with find a new identity and purpose in writing and art and sharing that process with other veterans and disadvantaged youth or whomever they want to work with. I think the other part is to speak back to another point that I made about sort of painting the full picture of the military experience. So I think sometimes veterans assume, it's okay, that we're sort of asking them to paint a specific picture. Okay, we're only looking for the combat medic to paint this, you know, sort of gory picture of their military experience. Well, that's not what we're looking for. We want to paint the full picture of the range of military experiences. And so we want every piece of that puzzle. We want the full painting, and it's really important that everybody's part of that. And so I think knowing that your story and your perspective is part of the broader picture and not just sort of feeding, you know, society and the media and the, you know, the movies, you know, the same sort of thing, but that there are boring days at war, right? Or that or that military sexual trauma happens, or, you know, all these different sort of experiences that are not part of the mainstream. And I think it's really important that people recognize that there is an audience for that, and we are looking to hear those full experiences, and not just, you know, when you're deployed, but when you come home. I mean, that's what we're all dealing with together. You're deployed, you're far away, that's over, but when you come back, we're all going to do this together. So I think that's also what's important and part of this whole picture is that you have to talk about that too, because that's something that we're all engaged in still. I don't know if I answered your question.
You made me think about a lot of other things. Stephanie, did you have anything?
Yeah,
on that?
I was in our work. Part of the creative process for us is the return home in and of itself. We see as a creative process, right? What is a home? And for us, that is not a static thing. And for veterans who are transitioning back to civilian life, to to give themselves the freedom to understand that as a process rather than a place, and to use dialogue and writing to discover and formulate that place. While it's therapeutic, I think also what happens in the process is there's a lot of critical thinking that's happening.
Yeah.
And it was really very rewarding for us to hear from the veterans with whom we worked how important it was for them to be able to think critically about their experiences. And of course, in our model, we're also tapping into the leadership. Every person who's been in service has had a leadership capacity. And our goal is in developing a way for, or a better understanding for how those leadership tools can come to play every day in their civilian lives. So really those connections, building new connections or recognizing the connections that are there, but that have not been formally tapped into or recognized within the veterans community is really an important part of the process.
I love the way you frame the road home being something that is not static. And it seems like so much of the work around helping foster self-expression in veterans is a notion that it's a process, not a product. And that connects again to so much of what we do that I really appreciate is oral history, and these collections of first-person narratives have so many moments of benefit, and they have this, an oral history is both a process and a product, so you get this emergence of two states happening at the same time, which I think is very common in the creative process. So you create a poem, and you create a poem, and you create a poem because it's when you write it, and then when someone else reads it, and then when you read it aloud. And so much of what you're talking about resonates with that. You also, each of you have mentioned in your responses, touching on the aspect of working primarily with recently returned veterans, or having a Vietnam veteran lead a discussion, and the veteran pipeline, getting one veteran to help another veteran understand about this project or this effort that you're engaging in. Do you find in particular, and I'll start with Stephanie, and I'd love for each of you to respond to this, do you find that there is a particular benefit or a particular, it doesn't have to be a benefit, I'm trying to frame this as open-ended as possible, but what is the result of engaging across generations? So with World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans, Korea veterans, to recent conflicts, is there anything you can share about that experience?
I think what we heard was a real appreciation within the cross-generational groups for the, I guess, the universality of experience. And while each person's specific experience in service is unique, to recognize the way in which service over time, in many ways, it's a shared bond. And sometimes that bond has to do with the call to serve, so how a person ended up in service to begin with. Sometimes the bond is the branch. Sometimes it is where one served. There's so many opportunities to recognize those bonds within a space where, at first, one may think those experiences are going to be so radically different, and yet one finds again that the commonalities are so much more prevalent and so much richer than one might initially anticipate.
Yeah, I think there's something very special and important and critical about getting veterans that recently transitioned. For instance, when I got out in 2008, I had no idea any resources available, people are there, there's a community outside of the military. And I went through periods of extreme loneliness, extreme separation. Um, and for me, I threw myself into like school and suppressed everything else because I didn't feel like there was a safe space for me to deal with things, to talk about things. I also felt that I thought dealing with things was to be as far away from anything that resembled the military. So I think there's something else to putting out that narrative that like this is a safe space. You can transition smoothly here in a calm way, as opposed to trying to bury your demons or self-medicate with other things, right? And I just think that it's just very important to get them then, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I've talked to veterans who said that they didn't talk about being a vet for 20 years. And I think, obviously, I think the more you hold in, the more dangerous it gets,
Yeah.
right? So we think we're protecting ourselves, but we're really just sort of setting ourselves up. So I think it is important to get folks to talk now. But, we have folks like Bruce who are Vietnam veterans and are sort of mentoring our veterans and working together. And I think definitely we need to look at their work, but I think what's more valuable really is to build those relationships, because you have Vietnam veterans who've been dealing with post-traumatic stress for 20, 30 years and can talk to the younger vets about how to do that. They can talk about writing, they can talk about all these other things. But, I'm always the person who has to bring up the hard things. And I think there's part of what's difficult about that is that, some of the younger veterans are, really, they're in with the times, right? So they're open to people that are trans. They're open to gay people. They're not racist. So I think some of the older veterans that our veterans come into contact with are having that sort of struggle with how to manage the generational differences. And I've seen that play out, but I've also seen the opposite of that, where people are, really on the same page and really getting a lot out of those relationships. But I think definitely there's a lot of value there, not just looking at the work, but in really engaging in those. And even though some of those relationships are difficult, I think there's value in kind of engaging those differences and conflicts and trying to figure it out together, because those veterans are more likely to listen to the other veterans and have those conversations and maintain that relationship and try to figure it out together, instead of just arguing with someone on the street. That's going to go nowhere. But if they're veteran to veteran, they're kind of trying to figure it out together, that work is going to be happening.
At the risk of taking time away from some of the other themes we wanted to talk about today, I'm so interested in whether you see a direct result between that and the creative process. Do you think it impacts what's happening when they're creating works?
In terms of those relationships with the, yeah, I think that the veterans I think the veterans are going to write their identities. I'm thinking of Ryan Halloran, who writes about being gay in the military, and I don't think that he's necessarily writing more or less because he's engaging with these conflicts, but I think he should. I think that's where that sort of work happens. I know those kind of things can happen, but I don't necessarily see it happening in what I'm doing, what I'm seeing.
Some of the conversations we've been having leading up to this have been about the tension between whether or not the creative spark, so whether you're, from our perspective, talking about creating an oral history or a first-person narrative together, or whether you're talking about writing, whether it has to be veteran to veteran, and where the benefit comes from broadening the circle and making sure you're getting other people. And Lavella, you speak to this. You've spoken to it for this previous hour as we've talked about how we all have to have some responsibility, whether we're veterans or service, military, family connected or not. And I wondered, in your specific programs, and I think, Mo, you probably have a lot to say to this from the perspective of the work you've seen at the NEA, but if you wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about the importance of reaching beyond the echo chamber of just veterans and of veteran-connected people, and how your work gives that opportunity or doesn't, or if that's a challenge. I see you nodding your head, Stephanie. I assume you.
We very much believe in all of the work that we do that solving problems or building understanding requires everyone at the table. And any assumption by whomever that veterans coming out of service ought to do that alone, should be, that should be a solitary process. That's not a viewpoint that we embrace at Touchstones. We really feel that we have a lot to learn from veterans' experiences, and that we do not make those opportunities available to us as a society. So I think that in the future, as we continue to work with more groups of veterans, we will be inviting more and more civilians to be co-participating in those programs. Our programs are always open, to the public, and I think that part of what we have been trying to learn in the first iterations of the programs that we've been running is how are we sensitive to the needs of the veterans, right? That needs to be something that's at the forefront of our thinking. And at what point is it constructive for civilians and veterans to be together? And it may not be that that's where you start, but that one builds that trust over time so that those groups can be constructive together in building a new understanding. So for us, it's vital. It's vital to our society that we have, that we hear the voices of veterans, that the leadership that has been instilled and practiced in service is available to us as a country. And I think we're starting to see more of that even in the political sphere with the number of veterans who are stepping up for public office. I think we will continue as a country to move more in that direction. At least certainly that's our hope.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think to the extent that we can get veteran voices in the mainstream from whatever perspective they're coming from, I think it's extremely important because, when I came here, I thought, when I first moved here, I was like, this is not a town that's sympathetic to veterans. You have to have an education to be heard in any sense. And I don't think that should be the case. Like, no one should be feeling that, right? That if you move to the South, then maybe they'll cater to your experience. But if you're in DC, no one cares, right? So you sort of feel muted in that sense. But I don't think that should be the case. And I think the way you resolve that is by putting veteran voices out, promoting it. At the NEA, we have the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, where they do this holistic wellness therapy, and that sort of stays in the isolated bubble because it's dealing with people dealing with TBI, traumatic brain injuries. But the Blue Star Museum program is one that I think engages the public and engages the experience and allows veterans to come in. But there's a dialogue that happens when they come into the museums. So I think in that sense, I think that the NEA's platform is able to spread that message, in that way, yeah.
I think, like I said, we're doing the National Endowment for the Humanities Project in Philadelphia where we have these discussions. But I think, we've done, Warrior Writers has done poetry readings where not that many people come. So I think it's still hard to get people to come out and listen to veterans' poetry. And I think some people have the assumption that it's just going to be sad or hard or gory, and some of it is, but I think it's also our responsibility. Part of the reason Warrior Writers came to be when I started it 11 years ago was because I was hearing all these stories and poetry by veterans, and I thought, this has to get out there in the world. People have to hear this. This is what's happening to our service members. We only hear from the media. We hear from the government. We don't hear from veterans themselves. So we need to hear this. We need to know what's happening to the people that are serving and are coming home. And so I think, I don't know how to do that. I think I think again, it's sort of people want the victim or they want the hero.
Right.
And we need to engage in opening that up and saying, you need to be ready to hear all of it. But it's not easy. And I think, again, that's why we do the Working with Vets 101 training before we have people come and volunteer with us. You need to get a little bit of a handle on who the population is, who the constituency is, and what's going to create a safe and comfortable space, and how to take care of yourself during that process, because if you hear a story by a veteran and that's really impacting you, maybe because of your own parents in the military or whatever, you have to take care of yourself. And so I think this idea of self-care and community care is something that we've been talking a lot about Warrior Writers. Self-care being, go to therapy, go to your appointments, take your meds, get acupuncture, whatever, but also community care, whereas, we're making these resources available, we're having wellness days, we're checking in with each other, we're providing meals, we're not going till from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., these sort of things around how do we create a culture that can really handle hearing some of these stories and supporting people in their process of coming home, which I think also, my partner's been home since 2004, and he's still, he didn't come here today because he wants to stay home and wants to, be by himself, and he's just dealing with a lot of anxiety. And so I think also the understanding that it's a process and it's a long process, and people go through that in these different ways, and there are a lot of different ways that you can engage with people in supporting them, and not necessarily talking about their military experience. Talk to veterans about their kids, or their hobbies, or their artwork, or whatever. It doesn't have to always be like, so let's talk about the military. Talk about I'm a person too. That's one thing we talk about in Warrior Writers. People just see veterans as only veterans, and you can only talk to them about that kind of stuff, and that's all that they want to talk about, or that's all that they are. And for people who are coming out of the military or have come out, they want to have other identities and other things that they're thinking about and doing, and it's important that we as civilians recognize that and see them as just people.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think so much that what's really frustrating a lot of times is that the narrative of the veteran's already sealed in society, and you sort of walk and operate within that, and that's frustrating because that doesn't speak to the individual and the individual's experience and the individual's voice, and it's one of those things where you sort of, like your husband, sorry, you kind of hate the veteran narrative, right? You hate hearing it, you hate stuff like this, because it's almost like it's already controlled. You're seeing it as this like thing, but you're not this. You're not beholden to this experience that you had in your life, right? You would like to be able to take the veteran mantle off at some point, not just be a person again.
There's so many rich bits that you've talked about as we've continued the conversation, and I'm struggling to come up with a good way to bring it to a natural conclusion, because what I want to do is just ask you questions all afternoon and explore all these themes that you've touched on that we talk about all the time, and around and around and around. Talk about them with guests, we talk about them with poets, and I just thank you so much for sharing, both on the personal and the professional, because in this work you have to do that all the time, and it can get uncomfortable. So thank you for doing that here with us. I do need to manage our time, so I'd like to give you each an opportunity if there's something you wanted to share this morning that I didn't cover, or I didn't get the question in the right way. If you want to think about that, and while you're thinking about that, as soon as they've had the chance to answer that question, we can take a few questions from the audience before we really have to wrap it up. So I'm told we can take one question or two questions from the audience. Is there anything further any of you would like to say?
So, in preparing for this, I talked to a few veterans, and there was one thing that someone said that you really, he said, you have to say this, and as a representative of a veterans organization, this is something that happens, I think, a lot. I'm speaking that, but anyway, he thought that it was really important that I recognize and say that sometimes when we talk about veterans writing, we sort of talk about it in this sort of healing and therapeutic way, and while that's true and important and valuable, and that's the case for some people, it's also depoliticizes the issue and the things that they're writing, and it's important that, he said that it's important that we recognize veterans as free-thinking individuals that are not just writing just to heal, but some of them are writing to articulate their stance on the war, their stance on, the state of the VA and the lack of funding, and I think it's important that we recognize, the diverse voices within that, and say, and recognize that, yes, healing is part of it, but that we can't always depoliticize it in that way, because then it sort of takes, again, away that power of veterans and their individual stories. You know, already they were in the military and they weren't allowed to sort of speak openly about, you know, whatever they believed in. I think that we can't perpetuate that once they've gotten out. We need to see those stories for what they are. So I needed to say that for Kevin and the rest of them.
Thank you, Lavella.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily need to say this, but I think if there's something to be said, and it sort of piggybacks off what you're saying, that I guess I would try to communicate to take the veteran out of the veteran box. Their story doesn't start at this, moment in time. It's a longer thing. I would like to think that everything that happened before and after still mattered, and this is not just the end of it. So I would say take the veteran out of the veteran box and just stretch them. So yeah.
Thank you, Mo.
And I guess I would encourage people to continue finding ways to have dialogue together and to explore what it means to be an American together, and to sort of see the bigger picture, service within that, as you've just described, right? But the entire continuum of one's life, and to really make room for that to be, to allow room for that in your own life.
Well, thank you, all of you, for sharing this and for the work that you're doing. And Mo, thank you for your service to us. I also need to thank David Surface at Fordham University for his help in formulating the questions, and Angie Hinsey from iScopes here at GW University for help formulating the questions. Thank you all for being with us, and I hope that you will continue the conversation with us and hear more poetry and more thought